A struggling American family in rural Tennessee hadn't eaten in 3 days when someone knocked on their trailer door at midnight. It was a woman in blue carrying groceries who said she was sent by the Virgin Mary. But when they opened the door to thank her, she had vanished without a trace. The August heat in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, was suffocating that summer of 2023 when Bob Johnson lost his job at the auto parts factory. The plant had been struggling for months, and when corporate decided to move operations to Mexico, Bob and 47 other workers got their pink slips on a Tuesday morning that felt like the end of the world. Bob was 42 years old, a good man who'd worked with his hands his entire adult life. He'd married his high school sweetheart Mary when they were both 19, and together they'd built what they thought was a stable life in their double-wide trailer on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much by some standards, but it was theirs, or at least it would be once they finished paying off the loan. Mary worked part-time at the local Dollar General, but her 20-hour-a-week schedule barely covered groceries in good times. With 3 kids to feed, Emma, 12, Tyler, 9, and little Sophia, just 4, Bob's factory paycheck had been the lifeline that kept the Johnson family afloat. "We'll figure something out," Mary had said that first night, holding Bob as he sat at their small kitchen table with his head in his hands. "God's got a plan for us." Bob nodded, but privately he wondered where God had been when the plant manager was handing out termination notices. The first month wasn't too bad. Bob had some savings, and unemployment benefits helped stretch things. He spent his days driving all over Middle Tennessee, filling out applications at every factory, warehouse, and construction company he could find. But the economy was tight, and competition was fierce among the suddenly unemployed factory workers flooding the job market. "Sorry, son," became the refrain Bob heard week after week. "We'll keep your application on file." By the second month, the savings were gone. Mary picked up extra shifts when she could, but the Dollar General was cutting hours too. Bob took odd jobs, helping neighbors move, doing yard work, anything that paid cash. It wasn't enough. The third month brought the real crisis. The trailer payment was 2 months behind, and the eviction notice was taped to their front door like a scarlet letter for all the neighbors to see. The electricity had been shut off for a week, and they were cooking over a camping stove that Bob had dug out of the shed. But the worst part was the empty refrigerator. For 3 days, the Johnson family had been living on nothing but hope and whatever scraps they could find in the back of their kitchen cabinets. Bob had found a can of green beans with no label and a box of stale crackers. Mary made them last as long as she could, giving most of her portions to the kids and claiming she wasn't hungry. Emma, at 12, was old enough to understand what was happening. She watched her parents' hushed conversations with worried eyes and helped her mother entertain Tyler and Sophia so they wouldn't focus too much on their growling stomachs. Tyler, 9 years old and all energy, had stopped asking when dinner would be ready. He'd seen his father cry for the first time in his life 2 nights ago, and something about that had made him understand that asking for food would only make things worse. Little Sophia was the hardest to watch. At 4, she didn't understand why her tummy hurt all the time or why Mommy looked so tired. She would bring Mary her favorite stuffed rabbit and pat her cheek with tiny hands, saying, "It's okay, Mommy. Bunny says it's okay." On the 3rd day without food, Bob made the hardest decision of his life. He walked to the Murfreesboro Community Food Bank, swallowing his pride with every step. "I'm sorry," the volunteer told him kindly but firmly. "We're completely out until our delivery truck comes on Friday. There's been such demand lately." Friday was 3 days away. Bob drove home in his 15-year-old pickup truck, wondering how he was going to tell his family that help wasn't coming. He'd never felt like such a failure in his entire life. That evening, as the family sat in their darkened trailer lit only by battery-powered lanterns, Bob tried to stay strong. "Tomorrow I'm going to drive over to Nashville," he announced, though he barely had gas money for the trip. "There's got to be something there." "That's a good idea, honey," Mary said, her voice hollow but trying to sound encouraging. The kids were unusually quiet. Even Sophia seemed to sense the gravity of their situation, curled up against her mother's side with her threadbare rabbit. Around 9 o'clock, Bob stepped outside to get some air and to hide the tears he couldn't hold back anymore. The night was muggy and still, with a kind of oppressive heat that made it hard to breathe. Their neighbors' trailers were lit up with the warm glow of electric lights, a luxury the Johnsons hadn't had for over a week. Bob looked up at the star-filled Tennessee sky and did something he hadn't done since he was a child. "God," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I know I ain't been the best Christian. I know I don't pray like I should, and I've said things I shouldn't have said. But my kids are hungry. My wife's hungry. We got nothing left." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I ain't asking for much. Just help us make it through tomorrow. Help me find a way to feed my family. Please." A gentle breeze stirred the humid air, but otherwise, the night remained silent. Bob stood there for another few minutes, then went back inside to find his family already settling down for the night. They'd pushed their mattresses together in the living room to stay close to each other, partly for comfort, partly because the bedroom was too hot without air conditioning. "I love you all," Bob said as he lay down beside Mary. "Tomorrow's gonna be better. I promise." But privately, he had no idea how he was going to keep that promise. The family drifted off to an uneasy sleep, their dreams filled with visions of full refrigerators and the security they'd lost. Outside, the Tennessee night settled into its usual rhythm of cricket songs and distant highway traffic. It was exactly midnight when the knocking began. The sound was soft but persistent, not the aggressive pounding of bill collectors or law enforcement, but the gentle rap of someone who didn't want to wake the whole neighborhood. Bob jerked awake first, instantly alert in the way that desperation had trained him to be. He listened carefully, wondering if he'd imagined it. Knock. 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 "Bob," Mary whispered beside him. "Someone's at the door. I hear it." Bob reached for the baseball bat he'd started keeping beside the bed. Times were hard all over, and desperate people sometimes did desperate things. Knock. 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 "Daddy." Emma's voice was small and scared. "Who is that?" "I don't know, sweetheart. Y'all stay right here." Bob crept to the front window and carefully pulled back the corner of the curtain. In the pale light from the security lamp across the way, he could see a figure standing on their small front porch. It was a woman middle-aged, maybe Hispanic, wearing what looked like a blue dress or robe. She was holding several grocery bags in her arms, and there was something about her posture that seemed patient rather than threatening. "Ma'am," Bob called through the door. "It's pretty late. Can I help you?" "I have food for your family," came the reply. The voice was gentle, with a slight accent that Bob couldn't quite place. "I was told you needed help." Bob looked back at Mary, who had sat up and was watching him with wide eyes. "Who told you that?" Bob asked. "A mother who cares about all her children," the woman answered. It was a strange response, but Bob was too hungry and too desperate to care about strange. He unlocked the door and opened it cautiously, keeping the chain lock engaged. The woman stood in the dim light, and Bob was struck by how peaceful she looked. Despite the late hour and the unusual circumstances, there was nothing threatening about her presence. If anything, she radiated a kind of calm that Bob hadn't felt in months. "Ma'am, I appreciate whatever this is, but we don't take charity," Bob said, though his stomach was gnawing at his backbone. The woman smiled, and it was the warmest smile Bob had ever seen. "This isn't charity, Mr. Johnson. This is love." The fact that she knew his name should have alarmed him, but somehow it didn't. Instead, it felt right. "How did you?" "Your children are hungry," she said gently, cutting him off. "And you are a good father who's trying to take care of his family. There's no shame in accepting help when it's offered with love." Bob studied her face in the dim light. There was something about her that reminded him of his grandmother, A woman who'd raised 8 children during the Depression and never met a hungry person she wouldn't feed. "Who are you?" "Someone who understands what it means to watch your child suffer," she replied. "May I come in?" Against every instinct that had been drilled into him about strangers and late-night visitors, Bob found himself unlatching the chain and opening the door wide. The woman stepped inside, and Bob was immediately struck by a scent he couldn't identify. Something floral and clean that seemed to push back the stale air of their closed-up trailer. "Mary," Bob called softly. "Come meet our visitor." Mary emerged from the living room, pulling a robe around herself, her eyes curious and cautious. "Ma'am," she said politely. "I'm Mary Johnson, Bob's wife." The woman's face lit up when she heard the name. "Mary. What a beautiful name. My name is, well, you can call me Maria." She set her grocery bags on the small kitchen counter, and Bob could see they were full to the brim with food. Real food, not just the generic brands they usually bought when times were good. "Ma'am. Maria, this is incredibly kind of you, but how did you know we needed help?" Maria turned to look directly at Mary, and her expression was infinitely gentle. A mother always knows when her children are suffering. Something in the way she said it made Mary's eyes fill with tears. It had been so long since anyone had shown them such pure kindness. "The children," Maria said. "They must be hungry." As if summoned by her words, Tyler appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Mom? What's happening?" "Tyler, come here, honey," Mary said. "This nice lady brought us some food." Tyler's eyes went wide when he saw the grocery bags. "Really? Actual food?" Maria knelt down to Tyler's level. "Really? Are you hungry, sweetheart?" Tyler nodded vigorously, and Maria reached into one of the bags and pulled out a box of his favorite cereal, a name brand that the Johnsons hadn't been able to afford in months. "How did you know he liked that kind?" Mary asked in wonder. "Lucky guess," Maria said with a smile. But Bob noticed that it wasn't just Tyler's favorite cereal. As Maria unpacked the bags, every single item seemed chosen specifically for their family. Emma's preferred brand of peanut butter. The organic milk that Sophia needed because regular milk upset her stomach. The coffee that Mary missed so desperately. "I don't understand," Bob said. "How could you know all this?" "Sometimes we know things we can't explain," Maria replied as she continued unpacking. "What matters is that your family will eat tonight." The bags seemed bottomless. Boxes of pasta, jars of sauce, fresh fruits and vegetables, bread, eggs, milk, and meat. Enough food to last them at least 2 weeks, maybe more. Emma and Sophia had joined them in the kitchen now, watching in amazement as their empty cupboards filled with groceries. "Are you an angel?" Sophia asked with the directness of a 4-year-old. Maria laughed, a sound like silver bells that made everyone in the room smile despite their circumstances. "I'm just someone who cares about families like yours," she said, gently stroking Sophia's hair. "Ma'am," Bob said, his voice thick with emotion, "I can't pay you back for this. Not right now. But as soon as I find work." "There is no debt," Maria said firmly. "The only thing I ask is that someday, when you're back on your feet, you help another family that's struggling. Will you promise me that?" "Yes, ma'am," Bob said without hesitation. "Absolutely." Maria finished unpacking and folded the empty bags neatly. "Your children should eat something now," she said. "Growing children shouldn't go to bed hungry." Mary was already reaching for the bread and peanut butter, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You don't need to thank me," Maria replied. "Watching you care for your children is thanks enough." As Mary began making sandwiches for the kids, Maria moved around their small kitchen with an ease that seemed natural, as if she'd been there before. She helped organize the groceries, putting things away in just the right places. "Maria," Bob said, "can I ask, How did you find us? How did you know? Maria paused in her organizing and looked at him with eyes that seemed infinitely wise and compassionate. I heard a father's prayer. Bob felt his breath catch in his throat. You heard. Help me feed my family, Maria quoted softly. Those were your words, weren't they? Bob stared at her in amazement. He had whispered those exact words to God just a few hours earlier, standing alone in his front yard under the Tennessee stars. But how could you? Faith moves mountains, Mr. Johnson. And love answers prayers. The children were eating now, their faces bright with joy as they bit into sandwiches made with real bread and real peanut butter. It was the first food they'd had in 3 days, and it might as well have been a feast. This is the best sandwich ever, Tyler announced around a large bite. Mine too. Sophia chimed in, peanut butter smeared across her cheek. Emma, more reserved at 12, simply ate with tears of relief in her eyes. Maria watched them with an expression of pure love that took Bob's breath away. In that moment, she looked exactly like what she claimed to be, a mother who cared about all children as if they were her own. I should go now, Maria said after the children had eaten their fill. Other families need help tonight. Wait, Mary said quickly. Please don't leave yet. Let me make you some coffee, or... That's very kind, but I have other stops to make. She moved toward the door, and Bob followed her. Maria, wait. At least tell me where you're from. How can we find you to thank you properly? Maria paused at the door and turned back to face the family. In the dim light from their battery-powered lanterns, her face seemed to glow with an inner peace that Bob had never seen in another human being. When you want to thank me, she said softly, look for me in the face of every person you help. Look for me in every act of kindness you show to others. That's where you'll find me. She opened the door and stepped out into the humid Tennessee night. God bless you, Maria. Mary called after her. God bless you. He already has, came the reply from the darkness. Bob stepped onto the porch, intending to walk Maria to her car or at least see which direction she went. But when he looked around the dimly lit trailer park, there was no one there. No car in the driveway. No figure walking away down the street. No sign that anyone had been there at all, except for the groceries now filling their kitchen. Mary, Bob called, his voice strange. Mary, come here. Mary joined him on the porch, and together they stared out into the empty night. Where did she go? Mary whispered. I don't know, Bob replied. She just vanished. They stood there for several minutes, looking for any trace of the woman who had saved their family. But Maria was gone as mysteriously as she had arrived. When they went back inside, the children were already getting sleepy, their bellies finally full for the first time in days. Where did the nice lady go? Sophia asked. She had to help other families, Mary said, tucking her youngest daughter into bed. Will she come back? Mary looked at Bob, who shrugged helplessly. I don't know, baby. But she left us enough food to last a long time. As they settled the children for the night, this time in their own beds, with full stomachs and hope in their hearts, Bob and Mary found themselves wide awake. Who was she? Mary whispered as they lay in bed. I don't know, Bob admitted. But Mary, she knew things. She knew Tyler's favorite cereal, she knew about Sophia's milk, she even knew what I prayed for earlier. What do you mean? Bob told his wife about his desperate prayer under the stars, and how Maria had repeated his exact words back to him. Mary was quiet for a long moment. Bob, do you think she might have been? What? An angel? Bob stared at the ceiling of their trailer, thinking about the woman who had appeared at midnight with exactly what they needed, who had known their names and their needs, who had vanished without a trace. I don't know, he said finally. But whoever she was, whatever she was, She saved us." The next morning, Bob woke up wondering if the entire night had been a dream brought on by hunger and desperation. But when he walked into the kitchen and saw their cabinets full of groceries, he knew it had been gloriously, impossibly real. Mary was already up, making pancakes from a box mix that Maria had brought, something they hadn't been able to afford in months. The smell filled their small trailer with a warmth that went beyond just food. "Daddy!" Sophia ran to him, syrup already sticky on her fingers. "The nice lady left us pancakes." "She sure did, baby girl," Bob said, lifting his youngest daughter and spinning her around. For the first time in months, her laugh sounded completely carefree. Tyler and Emma were at the small kitchen table, eating breakfast with the enthusiasm of children who had forgotten what it felt like to be truly hungry. Emma looked up at her father with eyes brighter than he'd seen them in weeks. "Dad, I had the weirdest dream last night," she said between bites. "I dreamed that a lady in a blue dress was standing by my bed, and she told me that everything was going to be okay." Bob felt a chill run down his spine. "What did she look like in your dream?" "Like Maria, the lady who brought us food. But in my dream, she was... I don't know how to explain it. She was glowing, kind of. And she had the kindest face I've ever seen." Mary stopped flipping pancakes and turned around. "Emma, honey, are you sure it was a dream?" "Well, yeah. I mean, people don't really glow, do they?" Bob and Mary exchanged a look over their daughter's head. After everything that had happened, they weren't sure what was possible anymore. The day passed in a strange mixture of normalcy and wonder. Bob made his usual rounds looking for work, but for the first time in months, he wasn't driven by panic. The weight of knowing his family would eat that night, and for many nights to come, gave him a confidence he'd lost. At the construction site where he'd been hoping to pick up day labor, the foreman actually had work available. "Johnson, right?" the man said, consulting his clipboard. "Someone called about you yesterday. Said you were reliable, hardworking. You can start Monday if you want." "Someone called about me? Who?" The foreman shrugged. "Didn't catch the name. Woman with an accent, I think. Said she'd worked with you before and you were good people." Bob was puzzled. He'd never worked construction before, and he certainly didn't know any women in the industry. But he wasn't about to question good fortune. "Yes, sir, I'll take it. Thank you." As he drove home with the promise of steady work, Bob found himself thinking about Maria's words, "Faith moves mountains, and love answers prayers." Maybe she was right. That evening, as the family sat around their small table for their first real dinner in weeks, Mary suggested something that surprised everyone. "I think we should say grace tonight," she said quietly. Bob looked at his wife in surprise. They'd never been particularly religious. They believed in God, certainly, but church had always seemed like something for other people, people who had their lives more together. "I think that's a good idea," he said finally. They joined hands around the table, and Bob struggled to find words that felt adequate for what had happened to them. "Dear God," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "we don't know how to thank you for sending Maria to us last night. We were lost, and hungry, and scared. And somehow, you knew exactly what we needed. Thank you for the food," Tyler chimed in. "And for making Daddy find work," Emma added. "And for the nice lady who made Mommy stop crying," Sophia said in her small, serious voice. Mary's eyes filled with tears at her youngest daughter's words. Had she been crying that much? Had her children been watching her fall apart? "Help us to be the kind of people who help others the way Maria helped us," Bob continued. "And if we ever see her again, help us to thank her properly." "Amen. Amen," the family echoed. As they ate their dinner, real meat, fresh vegetables, warm bread, Bob felt something shifting in his chest. It wasn't just gratitude, though he felt that in abundance. It was something deeper, something that felt like faith. Over the next few days, Bob started his new construction job and threw himself into the work with an energy he hadn't felt in months. His supervisor, a gruff man named Joe Martinez, was impressed with his dedication. "You work like a man with something to prove," Joe observed during their lunch break on Bob's third day. "I work like a man who's grateful to have work," Bob replied. Joe studied him with wise eyes. "You been through some hard times recently?" Bob found himself telling Joe about losing his factory job, about the 3 days without food, about the mysterious woman who had saved his family. Joe listened without judgment, nodding occasionally. "My grandmother would have said you were visited by La Virgin," Joe said when Bob finished his story. "La what?" "La Virgin Maria. The Virgin Mary. My grandmother, she came here from Mexico when she was young, and she always said that La Virgin watches over families in need. She appears to people sometimes, especially when children are suffering." Bob felt that familiar chill again. "Your grandmother really believed that?" "Believed it. Hell, she claimed it happened to her. Said when my father was little, during the Depression, they hadn't eaten for days. A woman in blue came to their door with food and told my grandmother that La Virgin had sent her." "What happened to the woman?" Joe shrugged. "Disappeared. Just like your Maria." That evening, Bob shared Joe's story with Mary as they cleaned up after dinner. Their children were outside playing, something they'd had energy for again since their mysterious visitor had arrived. "Bob, what if Joe's grandmother was right?" Mary asked quietly. "What if Maria wasn't just a person? What if she was more?" Bob had been wondering the same thing. "I keep thinking about what she said. About hearing a father's prayer. And the way she knew things about our family that no stranger could know. And the way she disappeared. People don't just vanish into thin air." They were quiet for a moment, watching their children through the kitchen window. Tyler was pushing Sophia on an old tire swing that Bob had hung from their oak tree, while Emma read a book in the shade. "Does it matter?" Bob asked finally. "Whether she was a person or an angel or something else. She saved our family when we had nowhere else to turn." "No," Mary said softly. "I guess it doesn't matter what she was. What matters is what she did." But privately, both of them were beginning to believe that their midnight visitor had been something more than human. The proof came 2 weeks later, when Bob got his first full paycheck from the construction job. It was more money than he'd expected. Apparently, Joe had recommended him for overtime shifts without mentioning it. "We can catch up on the trailer payment," Mary said, looking at the check with relief. "And put some aside for emergencies." But Bob was thinking about something else. "Mary, remember what Maria asked us to promise? That we'd help another family when we got back on our feet. I think it's time to keep that promise." The opportunity came sooner than they expected. Emma came home from school the next day with a story about her classmate Jessica, whose father had been injured in a car accident and couldn't work. "Mrs. Patterson, our teacher, said Jessica hasn't been eating lunch because her family can't afford to put money in her lunch account," Emma reported. "And yesterday she fainted during math class." Bob and Mary looked at each other across the dinner table. They both knew what they needed to do. The next morning, Bob stopped by the school office before work. "I'd like to put some money in Jessica Patterson's lunch account," he told the secretary. "But I don't want her to know who it came from." "That's very kind, Mr. Johnson. How much would you like to add?" Bob thought about his paycheck, about their own bills, about the promise he'd made to a woman who might have been an angel. Enough for the rest of the school year. That evening, as Bob told his family what he'd done, he felt something he'd never experienced before. It was the same warmth he'd felt when Maria had filled their kitchen with groceries, but this time it was coming from inside himself. "I'm proud of you, Daddy," Emma said seriously. "Jessica's going to be so happy." "We all should be proud," Mary added. "We're keeping our promise to Maria." As the weeks passed, the Johnson family found more opportunities to help others. Mary organized a clothing drive at Tyler's school. Bob helped his elderly neighbor repair his roof without being asked. The children started sharing their lunch snacks with classmates who had less. It became a way of life for them, looking for chances to pass on the kindness that had saved them. 3 months after Maria's visit, Bob was working on a construction site across town when he saw something that made his heart stop. A woman in a blue dress was walking between the buildings, carrying grocery bags and talking to a man who looked desperate and defeated. Bob dropped his tools and ran toward them, but by the time he reached the spot where he'd seen her, there was only the man, sitting on a pile of lumber with tears in his eyes and groceries scattered around his feet. "Sir, are you okay?" Bob asked. The man looked up at him with amazement. "You're not going to believe this, but a woman just gave me all this food for my family. We haven't eaten in 2 days, and she somehow knew exactly what we needed." Bob felt his pulse racing. What did she look like? Hispanic woman, maybe middle-aged. Beautiful smile. Said her name was Maria. Where did she go? The man pointed vaguely toward the street. "She was just here, and then, I don't know. I turned around to thank her again, and she was gone." Bob helped the man carry his groceries to his car, listening as he described his family's situation. Lost job, sick child, utilities about to be shut off. It was a story Bob knew all too well. "Sir," Bob said as they loaded the last bag, "things are going to get better for you. I don't know how I know that, but I do." "You really think so?" "I know so. And when they do get better, when you're back on your feet, find a way to help someone else who's struggling. Pass it on." The man nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. I'll never forget this kindness." As Bob watched the man drive away, he realized that Maria was still out there, still answering prayers, still feeding hungry families. And somehow, knowing that filled him with a peace he'd never experienced before. That night, Bob shared the story with his family. They listened in wonder, and when he finished, Sophia spoke up with the clarity that only a 4-year-old could possess. "Maria's like Santa Claus, but for hungry people," she announced solemnly. Everyone laughed, but Bob thought his youngest daughter might be closer to the truth than any of them realized. A year later, the Johnson family was not only back on their feet but thriving. Bob had been promoted to crew chief on his construction team. Mary had gotten a full-time job at a local bank. The children were healthy and happy, their old fears of hunger just a distant memory. But they never forgot their promise to Maria. On the 1-year anniversary of that midnight visit, the Johnson family did something special. They loaded up their truck with groceries and drove to the poorest part of town, looking for families who might need help. They found the Martinez family, immigrants from Honduras whose father had been laid off from his restaurant job. When Bob knocked on their apartment door at 8 in the evening, carrying bags of groceries, the woman who answered began to cry. "Como sabía?" she asked through her tears. "How did you know?" "A friend taught me to look for people who need help," Bob replied in his limited Spanish. As they unloaded the groceries, the Martinez children, 3 little ones with wide, hungry eyes, reminded Bob powerfully of his own kids that terrible night a year ago. "¿Quién es usted?" the father asked. "Who are you?" Bob thought about how to answer that. He wasn't anyone special, just a construction worker who'd learned about grace from a mysterious woman in blue. "Somos una familia que recibió ayuda cuando la necesitábamos," he said carefully. "Y ahora queremos ayudar a otros." We're a family who received help when we needed it. And now we want to help others. As they prepared to leave, the Martinez children gathered around Bob and Mary, hugging them with the fierce gratitude of those who have been saved from desperation. Walking back to their truck, Mary took Bob's hand. "Do you think Maria would be proud of us?" Before Bob could answer, Tyler spoke up from behind them. "Dad, look." Bob turned and saw his son pointing at a woman walking down the street away from them. Even in the dim streetlight, her blue dress was unmistakable. "Maria!" Bob called out, breaking into a run. But when he reached the spot where he'd seen her, the street was empty. There was only the faint scent of flowers in the air, and a sense of peace that settled over his heart like a blessing. Bob stood there for a moment, looking up at the Tennessee stars that had witnessed his desperate prayer 2 years ago. He thought about the journey his family had been on, from desperation to hope, from despair to faith, from receiving grace to giving it. "Thank you," he whispered to the night sky. "Thank you for teaching us how to see you in everyone we help." A gentle breeze stirred the humid air, and Bob could have sworn he heard a familiar voice carried on the wind. "Well done, my good and faithful servant." When he rejoined his family at the truck, they were all staring at the spot where the woman in blue had been. "Did you see her too?" Mary asked softly. "We all did," Emma said with certainty. She was smiling. As they drove home through the quiet streets of Murfreesboro, the Johnson family understood something profound. Maria hadn't just saved them from hunger that desperate night. She had taught them how to recognize the sacred in the ordinary, the divine in the human need for compassion. They never saw her again in person, but they felt her presence every time they helped a struggling family, every time they shared their abundance with those who had less, every time they chose love over fear. Because some visitors leave more than groceries when they come calling at midnight. Some leave a transformation of the heart that lasts a lifetime and touches every person lucky enough to encounter that transformed love. And in trailers and apartments and houses all across Tennessee, families continue to tell the story of the woman in blue who appears when hope is lost, carrying grocery bags and the promise that no one who calls out to heaven in genuine need will be forgotten. The Virgin Mary still walks among us, they say, and she still answers prayers, sometimes through miraculous interventions, and sometimes through ordinary people who have learned to love as extraordinarily as she does. And there you have it. This incredible story of divine providence and family transformation touched your heart, didn't it? The Johnson family proved that when we cry out to God in our darkest hour, the Virgin Mary hears our prayers and sends help in the most miraculous ways, right? If you were moved by this real testimony of how a struggling American family was saved by a mysterious woman in blue who appeared at their trailer door at midnight with groceries and hope, and then vanished without a trace, hit that like button below. It really helps me continue sharing these stories that show Mary's endless compassion for families in crisis. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Every week there's a new testimony that will renew your faith that the Virgin Mary never abandons families who are struggling to survive, especially when children are involved. And don't forget to check out our store in the first pinned comment. We have amazing Christian products, including the 365-day Devotional, perfect for strengthening your trust in divine providence during tough times. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever experienced unexpected help during your family's darkest moment? Do you believe the Virgin Mary still appears to help struggling families today? And if you also believe in Mary's miraculous provision for those in need, write, "Mary provides miracles," declare your faith in her divine intervention. Share this video with families going through financial hardship, with parents struggling to feed their children, with anyone who needs to know that God sees their suffering and Mary carries their prayers straight to heaven. Thanks for watching until the end. May the Virgin Mary bless your family with her providential care and never let you face impossible circumstances alone. See you in the next testimony.